A man who once taught history became a lesson himself. When Baron Trump saw his old teacher, Mr. Callahan, living on the streets, he knew he couldn't just walk away. The city was always fast-paced. Drivers rushed through red lights, conversations were shouted over the noise of espresso machines, and everyone's schedules were packed tight. Baron had grown up in this hustle, barely stopping for anything. But that day was different. He had just stepped out of a coffee shop on a chilly afternoon, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat, when he noticed a figure slumped near the curb. At first, he barely looked, just another homeless person in a city full of them. But something about the man seemed familiar, making Baron slow down. The man was wrapped in layers of worn-out clothes, his face hidden beneath an overgrown beard, shoulders hunched as if he was carrying the weight of the world. Then it clicked. The way the man held himself, the curve of his jawline beneath the scruff. It was Mr. Callahan, his old history teacher. Baron's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen the man in years. The memories hit Baron like a truck. Mr. Callahan wasn't just any teacher. He was the teacher. He was the kind who didn't just read from textbooks, but brought history to life, turning dull lectures into gripping stories of courage and defiance. He was the one who pushed his students to think for themselves, who once told a 15-year-old Baron, "True leadership isn't about power. It's about what you do when no one's watching." And now, here he was, sitting on the sidewalk. For a moment, Baron just stood there, his mind racing for an explanation. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe it was someone who just looked like Mr. Callahan. But then, as if sensing someone's eyes on him, Mr. Callahan lifted his head. Their eyes met. It was only for a second, but the recognition was instant. The older man flinched, almost as if he wished he could disappear into the concrete. Mr. Callahan looked away first, rubbing his hands together for warmth, pretending not to see Baron. But Baron had already seen enough. His chest tightened. How does a man like Mr. Callahan end up here? A man who spent decades shaping young minds. A man who once stood at the front of a classroom commanding respect. A million questions rushed through Baron's mind, but only one truly mattered. What happened to him? Before Baron could take a step forward, something in Mr. Callahan's face made him hesitate. For a brief moment, Baron hesitated too. Part of him wanted to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. Not out of indifference, but because, really, what do you even say to a man who's lost everything? But something kept his feet rooted to the spot. The memory of Mr. Callahan standing in front of a classroom, passionately explaining the fall of great empires, made the decision for Baron. He took a breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan?" he said. The man barely reacted. His fingers tightened around the edges of his tattered coat, and he shifted slightly, as if bracing for something, but didn't look up. "It's me!" Baron tried again, lowering his voice. "Baron Trump." That got a reaction. Slowly, Mr. Callahan turned his head. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, were now tired and sunken, like a man who had spent too long fighting, a battle he knew he couldn't win. For a long second, he just stared. Then, recognition flickered across his face. "Baron," he murmured, his voice rough. His lips parted as if he wanted to say more, but no words came. Mr. Callahan let out a small, breathy chuckle without any humor. "Didn't think I'd ever run into one of my students like this." Baron forced a smile, though his stomach twisted. "Yeah, it's been a while. I didn't expect to see you. Out here." Mr. Callahan nodded slowly, looking down at his hands as silence stretched between them. Baron glanced around. The street was bustling with people, all too busy to notice the man sitting in the cold. It made him sick. This was Mr. Callahan, a man who once commanded a classroom with his words, now invisible to everyone. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" Baron asked carefully. Mr. Callahan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Depends on the night." That answer hit Baron harder than he expected. Fighting the lump in his throat, he finally asked, How did this happen?" Mr. Callahan let out a bitter chuckle. Budget cuts. School didn't have enough funding, so they started letting people go. I was one of the first, too old to keep up. Barron knew Mr. Callahan was right. Money wasn't the solution. But if not, then what was? He walked away, but his mind stayed behind. The city around him blurred into background noise, horns blaring, conversations overlapping, the distant hum of a street performer's saxophone. All he could think about was Mr. Callahan sitting there, shoulders hunched against the cold, saying, "Money's not gonna fix this." Barron had seen homeless people before, in passing, but this was different. This was personal. By the time he reached his car, he felt restless, like something was crawling under his skin. He sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. He had grown up in a world where every problem had a solution. If something was broken, you fixed it. If someone needed help, you offered it. But this was different. An entire life unraveled, and a handful of cash wouldn't sew it back together. He thought back to when he was 15, sitting in Mr. Callahan's class, rolling his eyes at a lecture about the Great Depression. History isn't just names and dates, Mr. Callahan had said, pacing at the front. History was cycles, real people, real choices made by those with power and those without. Barron never imagined his own teacher would end up trapped in one of those cycles. The thought left him feeling guilty, angry, and helpless, all at once. His phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, a casual invite to a weekend event, but Barron ignored it. How could he just go on with his life knowing Mr. Callahan was out there with nothing? His mind raced with possibilities. He could book a hotel room for a few nights, give him enough money to get by for a few weeks, maybe even connect him to a shelter, but none of it felt like enough. That thought sat heavy in his chest. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over his contacts, wondering who could help. His father? No, he didn't want to turn this into a media circus. His mother? She had a good heart, but this was something he needed to handle himself. Then an idea formed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He scrolled through his contacts and stopped at a name, an old school connection. Barron hesitated for just a second before calling an old school administrator he still kept in touch with, someone who might have answers. The phone rang a couple of times before a surprised voice answered. "Barron? Didn't expect to hear from? You." Gripping the steering wheel, Barron got straight to the point. "Yeah, I need some information about an old teacher, Mr. Callahan, history department." There was a long pause that made Barron's stomach tighten. Finally, the voice said, "Barron, you might want to sit down for this." Just like that, Barron knew there was more to the story. "Just tell me," he urged. A sigh came from the other end. Callahan didn't just lose his job, he was pushed out. After the school started cutting positions, they let go of senior teachers first. Callahan fought back, went public, wrote an op-ed about how budget cuts were hurting students, even called out the administration. The voice trailed off, but Barron already understood. The administration had fired Mr. Callahan for speaking out about their misuse of funds, though they wouldn't call it that. "So they fired him for telling the truth?" Barron asked, his jaw clenching. "They wouldn't put it that way," the voice replied. "But yeah, and they made sure no other school in the district would hire him. Word got around. Suddenly he was difficult to work with." Barron exhaled sharply, his stomach twisting. He knew how the world worked, how those in power silenced anyone who didn't follow the script. But hearing it happen to someone like Mr. Callahan, someone who had only ever tried to help, made his blood boil. "They ruined his life," Barron muttered. The voice on the phone hesitated. "It gets worse. He tried to fight it legally, but the legal fees drained whatever savings he had left. After that, well, you saw where he ended up." Barron's grip on the wheel was white-knuckled. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a system designed to break people like Callahan for daring to push back. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Does the school board still have anyone who had a hand in this? Barron asked. Yeah, the voice replied after a pause. The superintendent, Richard Lattimore, was one of the main decision-makers. Back then, he's still in charge. That was all Barron needed to hear. I'll call you back, he said, hanging up quickly. His fingers flew over his phone, finding the number for the school's main office. He pressed call and waited, heart pounding. After a few rings, a receptionist answered. Harrison Academy, how can I direct your call? I need to speak with Superintendent Lattimore, Barron said steadily. I'm sorry, but he's in a meeting. Tell him it's Barron. Trump, he insisted. There was a pause, then, hold, please. Barron's leg bounced impatiently, adrenaline buzzing through him. He had no idea what he was going to say, only that he couldn't let this go. Finally, the line clicked. Barron, what a surprise! Lattimore's voice came through, all fake warmth. To what do I owe the pleasure? Barron didn't bother with pleasantries. I ran into Mr. Callahan today. Silence, then a careful, oh. He's homeless, Barron said, not hiding his disgust. A man who dedicated his life to teaching, and you threw him away like garbage. Lattimore exhaled through his nose. That's unfortunate, but... Fix it, Barron cut in sharply. Lattimore let out a dry chuckle. I don't know what you think I can do. You can do something, Barron shot back. And you will, because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened. A long silence stretched between them before Lattimore sighed. What do you want? A job, a second chance, whatever it takes to get him off the streets, Barron demanded. Lattimore hesitated, but Barron could almost hear the gears turning. This wasn't about morals. It was about optics, and Lattimore knew what kind of headlines would follow if he refused. Finally, the superintendent spoke. I'll see what I can do. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Barron had opened the door. Now he just had to make sure Mr. Callahan walked through it. As soon as he hung up, Barron was already thinking ahead. Getting Lattimore to agree was one thing, making sure he followed through was another. Barron drove back toward the cafe, hoping Mr. Callahan was still there. The thought of him disappearing into the city, lost in a sea of people who didn't care, made his chest tighten. But when he pulled up, his stomach sank. The spot was empty. He parked quickly, stepping out and scanning the street. But there was no sign of him. The cup Mr. Callahan had been holding was gone, and the flattened cardboard he'd been sitting on was just another piece of trash now. Desperate for answers, Barron approached a nearby food cart vendor. Excuse me, do you know what happened to the guy sitting there earlier? He asked. The vendor barely glanced up. Old guy? Couple of city workers came by, told him to move along. Barron's pulse quickened. Where? The man shrugged, already turning back to his next customer. No idea. Just told him he couldn't stay there. Barron exhaled sharply, frustration creeping in. He knew how this worked. The city didn't care why people were homeless, only that they didn't want to see them. His eyes darted to a woman standing near a newspaper stand, an overstuffed bag slung over her shoulder. She looked like she'd been on the streets long enough to know the patterns. Barron approached her. Ma'am, I'm looking for someone. Older. Guy, beard, used to be a teacher. They told him to move. Any idea where he'd go? The woman squinted at him. You a cop? No, Barron said quickly. He's my old teacher. I need to find him. She studied him for a moment, then jerked her head toward the next block. Try the shelter off 14th. If he ain't there, check the church on Franklin. They do night meals. Thank you, Barron said with a nod, his heart pounding as he got back in the car. The city was massive, and finding one person who didn't want to be found wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't giving up. The shelter was packed when Barron stepped inside, the scent of coffee and worn-out fabric heavy in the air. People, huddled in corners, some wrapped in blankets, others staring blankly at the walls. A volunteer at the front desk looked up as Barron approached. "Hi," Barron said, keeping his voice low. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Mr. Callahan. Older guy, probably came in recently." The volunteer frowned, checking a TI list. No one by that name registered, but some don't give their real names. Barron's pulse quickened. "Is there a way I can check?"